Welcome to the Vantage HR Influencers Podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Vantage Circle, the simple and AI-powered rewards and recognition platform for employee engagement.
Employers are increasingly focusing on their employees' happiness because research suggests that companies with happier employees are more successful on average than those with unhappy employees. Happy employees are often healthier, more productive, and seem to have better workplace relationships. So, who do you think is responsible for employees' happiness at work? Is it the employer, a manager, a colleague, or a consumer? What are the determinants of happiness at the workplace? We'll know everything about that in today's episode with our guest speaker. I'm so excited to welcome Dr. Timothy Shah. An internationally renowned leader in the fields of positive psychology and mental health, Dr. Tim is a consultant and executive coach, speaker, writer, and spokesperson. He is Australia's very own Dr. Happy, at the forefront of the positive psychology movement and founder of the Happiness Institute. Welcome to the show, Tim.
Hi there, thanks for having me.
Okay, so Tim, you have set up the Happiness Institute and you are its Chief Happiness Officer. And in fact, you are known as Australia's very own Dr. Happy, right? What inspired you to work in the area of happiness?
Well, I need to go back a few years to explain that story.
Yeah.
My background originally was in clinical psychology. So I started out as a therapist and an academic and researcher. So in my early career, I was working as a therapist, helping people with problems like stress and depression and anxiety and coping with chronic illness. I was doing some research and I was teaching at one of the major universities here in Sydney, Australia. I did that for many years. And even after I left the public system and the university, I established a private practice, a clinical psychology practice, which was very successful. But then around the early 2000s, I stumbled across what was the very early beginnings of positive psychology. So for those who might not be familiar, the difference is that historically psychology is focused mostly on problems, on stress and depression and anxiety, on negative emotions and on dysfunction. And the idea was that if we could identify those problems and help people overcome them, that we'd be doing a good job. And that's partly true. But about 20 years ago, a few psychologists started to say, well, for so long we've been asking what's wrong with people and how do we fix it? What if we were to actually ask what's right with people and how can we make the most of it? And so from then they started to more formally study thriving and flourishing and happiness and positive emotions, and started to look at applications not just for the individual but for families and organizations, workplaces and communities. And it was then that I established the Happiness Institute as a way of trying to promote those, what I thought were very exciting principles of positive psychology. So that's how it started.
Right. So, your main area of interest has always been enhancing happiness at work. Am I right?
Yes, well, when I started out, I wasn't really sure. Really, it was a fairly new area, and I was just really excited by the idea of promoting positivity and promoting happiness. But here in Sydney, Australia, I was pretty much the first person to be really talking about that, and it just so happened that I got a lot of interest from organisations and businesses, large and small, who could see the potential benefits in having an engaged workforce, a positive workforce. So yes, from those early days, I started to do a lot of work with leaders and teams, helping them build positive engagement, build a positive culture, which we now know, there's a lot of good research now, we now know that a positive culture is associated with positive outcomes like performance and productivity and ultimately profitability.
Right. Okay, so why do you think happiness at work is important?
Well, I can answer that in two ways, I suppose. If we look at the opposite almost, if we look at the opposite of happiness at work, and if we look at stress and burnout and overworking, we know that that's distinctly unhelpful. And it's pretty simple, really. If you imagine a workforce full of miserable people, full of people who are stressed and anxious and worried, then, how could they possibly be expected to perform at their best? They can't. They can't perform well individually if they're stressed and anxious and depressed and frustrated, but they also can't perform well as a team because we don't collaborate as well. We don't work as well with others if we're stressed and anxious. So that's the kind of negative side. If we don't get it right and we see a lot of burnt out, stressed individuals, we're not going to really get the most out of them. The flip side of that is we do know from the research that happiness in its broader sense in the workplace, positivity in the workplace is correlated with more creativity and innovation, which means better problem solving, better collaboration, which means we work better with our teammates, and also with clients, more resilience, more connection, more of all the good things that ultimately lead, as I said a bit earlier, to good performance. So, happiness at work, I think, is a vital component of a successful workplace. That being said, I want to say one more thing. It is important to be realistic, and it is important to note that none of us will be happy all the time. No one will be happy every minute of every day. So, again, the caveat is that we do need to be realistic and acknowledge that we're all going to have our good and bad days. We're going to have some days when we have to do things we don't really like. But overall, if the general trend is towards positivity, that's undoubtedly a good thing.
Right. Okay. So when we talk about the determinants now, happiness at work, it is definitely more than just a combination of smart investments and good returns. So what does a happy workplace look like?
Yeah, look, that's a really, really good question, but it's actually a really hard question to answer because it will look like different things in different workplaces. And this is really important. I get asked that question a lot, and people publish books and publish articles about what a happy workplace looks like. But the reality is that there's no one single answer because workplaces are different and cultures are different and organizations are different for all sorts of reasons. So one answer to your question is a happy workplace will look different in every organization. That being said, there are some common factors that we do know are going to be relevant to most organizations most of the times. And the other part of the answer is that those common factors are not necessarily some of the things that a lot of wellbeing programs focus on. I get frustrated by this quite a lot, actually, because you see in the press a lot of talk about ping pong tables and bean bags and restrooms and all these sorts of things, which are fine. There's nothing actually wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with having someone visit to give massages once a week. But the reality is you've got to get the fundamentals right first. And those superficial elements won't work if you don't have the fundamentals. And the fundamentals of a positive workplace, of a positive culture, are things like psychological safety. Now, psychological safety is when, we feel comfortable that we can bring our real selves to work. It's when we feel comfortable that we can put up our hand and disagree with someone, or that we can comment without fear of negative consequences. It's about trust and respect. So, these things are fundamental and need to really get those things like psychological safety, like trust, right before you can start adding on some of those other things which are a little bit simpler and can be useful, but as I said, which won't work without the basics.
Right. Yeah. So nowadays, most companies invest in happiness coaches. They invest in team building activities, games, consultants, and as you know, chief happiness officers. So these practices and titles may appear lighthearted, but they're very, taken very seriously by the businesses nowadays. On the other hand, most employees they think that companies utilize happiness to extract superior efficiency from their workers, not because they really want them to be happy. So how can officers or managers set a balance in this aspect so that their efforts don't seem adulterated?
Yeah, again, really good question. I'll go back. There's a couple of different components to that. I'll try to tease them apart. There's no doubt that a lot of people are taking this more seriously, and that's a good thing. Although I think there's still a long way to go. There are a lot of organisations who do it poorly, and as a result, I think they're missing out. So organisations that don't value this, that aren't putting resources into it, are not going to get the best out of their organisations or out of their people. But you're 100% right. You can bring in someone like me, or coaches or consultants, but that's actually not going to really work if the intentions are wrong. And as I said a bit earlier, the intentions have to be around building a positive culture, building a place where people feel comfortable, where they feel safe and secure, and that there's trust there. If organisations are doing it for the wrong reasons, that will be obvious to employees, as you said, and it can actually backfire. That can actually work against it and get the opposite results, or not necessarily achieve the outcomes that people want. However, I think the big issue here is this dichotomy that's created between, on the one hand, this idea that organizations will say, bring in someone like me, bring in a happiness consultant because they really care about their employees or because they're just trying to get more productivity. I would say that those two can and should work well together. And this is, I think, the big, this is the secret. This is the holy grail, I suppose, so to speak. When this works properly, when positive psychology principles are properly and authentically, genuinely, with good intention, integrated into the systems and processes of an organization, they will be about caring for the employees. They will be about providing that support and trust and all those other things. But ultimately, they will also then get good results. So I do think they can work really well together. Right. And I guess that the final piece of that puzzle is that, as much as I like being invited into organizations and much as I think it's great that organizations bring in happiness coaches or whatever, ultimately, an outsider like myself can only achieve so much. What I think my job is to do is to ultimately make myself redundant by making the CEO, the senior leaders, the managers and executives, each and every one of them should effectively be a chief happiness officer. Because if it's just one person, whether it's me or maybe the head of HR, that's never really going to work. Every senior leader, every senior manager, everyone within the organization to some extent needs to play a role in this. And I think that's a really, really important part of, the best cultures. We see that it's not totally reliant on just one individual.
Right. So what are some of the best ways to boost happiness at work and increase productivity at the same time?
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, I'll preface this by saying that it will differ for different organizations, and even within large organizations. I've worked with some really big banks and some or very large organizations that have tens of thousands of employees. It's not just that it'll differ from one organization to the other, but even some teams within the same organization will differ because different teams have different personalities, so to speak, and different goals. So I will say that again, it's not one size fits all. Different things will work for different people. But some of the things that we know from the research work are, as much as possible, we want all employees to have as much control as possible over what they do. So this is what's sometimes called job design. We want each individual, each employee, to design their own jobs as best they can to suit their strengths and personality. So what that means is, I will, if I'm your manager, I will say, these are your goals, these are your KPIs, this is what I want you to achieve, but I'm going to let you do that in a way that works for you. So rather than telling people exactly how to do it, letting them decide, we know that giving them that control, allowing them to design it in their own way, leads to a greater sense of efficacy and confidence, which leads to more happiness and better outcome. Now, again, I'll qualify that by saying that's not possible 100% of the time with every individual and every job, but it could be done a lot more and a lot better. And again, the results suggest that when people have a sense of control over their day-to-day jobs, they tend to perform better and enjoy it more. A big part of that is also allowing people to bring their strengths to work. Now, psychological strengths are positive attributes that we all have. And too many organizations don't take advantage of this. I think too many organizations just focus on skills, which are important. We all need, we need skills, we need knowledge, we need experience. But there's another layer that we all have. As I said, these are psychological strengths or psychological attributes, which are significantly underutilized. I mean, in the Gallup research said that only about 20% of people feel they can bring their strengths to work each and every day. That means about 80% don't feel that they can bring their strengths to work, and that's a massive waste. Right. So finding ways to allow people to bring their full self, to bring their psychological strengths to work, to their job, to use them as best they can is another great way to both enhance productivity and, as I said, enhance happiness and satisfaction at work as well. There are lots of other things, but one other thing that's one of the other big ones is about building positive relationships at work. There's no doubt that people who feel more connected, who feel like they're closer and have more friendships within the workplace, tend to have a greater sense of belonging and again enjoy themselves more. And again, so much of what we do within the workplace is collaborative. I mean, most of us, very few of us work totally alone. Most of us work with other people in teams. So the better we get on with those other people, the more we like them, the more we trust them, the better those relationships are. the better the outcomes for everyone involved. So, there are lots of other little things, but there are a couple of the big guns which a lot of organizations, as I said, could do a lot better.
Yeah. So what do you think about rewards and recognition as a factor to boost happiness at work?
Yeah, look, rewards and recognition are, that's an age-old strategy. I think every organization, most HR managers use that in some way or other, and there's definitely benefits to that. I mean, we know that having a sense of accomplishment and achievement is good. That when we feel like we're achieving something and accomplishing something, that's a form of happiness, which is good for us. And we also know that when we do achieve and accomplish, being recognized, being appreciated is really important. So there's no doubt that showing appreciation, managers and leaders particularly that show appreciation to their employees, to their workers, that's a very effective strategy. However, I do think it's often done poorly, or sometimes actually done in a way that's counterproductive. And it comes down to what we actually reward. So, for example, one of the mistakes that's often made is people are rewarded for spending long hours in the office, regardless of what they're actually producing.
Right.
This is a big myth that if you're at your desk for 10 or 12 hours a day, that's something to be celebrated. Well, not necessarily. Not if those 10 or 12 hours are unproductive. Not if you're wasting time for that. If someone's actually achieving more in 6 hours, then they should be rewarded in a sense. So to come back to your question, the idea of reward and recognition is inherently it's a good one. In principle, it's a good one, as long as we're focusing on the right sorts of behaviours, on the right sorts of processes that we really do want to reinforce and reward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so one of the most beneficial things we can do for our mental health is to take time for ourselves. That is what we call the me time, right? So why this me time is so vital, and why we should never feel guilty for having it during work pressure?
Yeah, well, it's pretty simple, really, I think. It's simple, but not always easy to do. It's simple because it's no different to aspects of our physical health. So, for example, we know that if someone gets physically sick, they might need to take sick leave. They need to take time off, whether it's a broken bone or a bad case of the flu, or maybe at the moment a case of COVID. But if someone is physically sick, they have to have a dental work done. They'll go to the doctor, they'll go to the dentist, they'll get their whatever it is patched up, and they might take a few days, maybe even a week or two off to rehabilitate, to recover. Our mental health should be no different. It isn't any different, and in fact, it's just as, if not more important. So, if someone has an episode of mental ill health, if they're stressed or depressed or anxious or whatever it might be, they should be allowed, they should be encouraged to attend to that, to go to the relevant doctor, the relevant health professional, psychologist, whoever it might be, get the appropriate treatment. Because if they don't, they will only suffer more. And if they suffer more, they'll ultimately need more time off, or they'll be less productive for a longer period of time. So ideally, we should do this as early as possible, and by taking things into our own hands, by practicing self-care, we hopefully won't get to the stage, or we'll avoid needing to see the doctor. If we get in earlier, we might only need half a day off or a day off, or rather than a few weeks off or whatever. And so it's a really, really important thing to do to ensure our longevity in the workforce and our longevity in life, I suppose. The reason it's difficult, though, is that most of us aren't taught to do that. In fact, most of us are taught to sort of soldier on and keep pushing on, particularly when it comes to mental health. Most of us are taught to hide it, not to talk about it because of the stigma. But that's inherently problematic. And in fact, it's counterproductive, because if we don't talk about these things, if we don't acknowledge them and address them, they'll only get worse. So we do need to, we need to smash the stigma. That's a really important part of it. We need to break down some of those myths and misconceptions, and we need to make it more common practice for people to put up their hand and say, I'm depressed. That should be no different to putting up their hand and say, I've got a broken arm, or I need to go to the dentist. If we can get to that stage, it'll be a lot easier for people. And if it becomes a lot easier for people, they'll do it sooner and more effectively. And, that can actually save workplaces lots and lots of money, because sick leave and absenteeism is very, very expensive. So, if we can minimize that, it's good for the individual, but it's also good for the organization.
Right. Okay. So when I talk about the mornings, no, it can be a nightmare for the working moms, especially when they are working from home. So while sticking to her schedule for like making breakfast, doing other household work, and getting the child ready for school, and not getting late to work herself, most mothers tend to skip breakfast. So I read an article where you mentioned the importance of breakfast, team. So let's end this podcast with some foodie thoughts, and would love to hear your suggestions on the same.
Yeah, well, firstly, let me, I mean, as a parent myself, not a mother, but as a parent myself, I'll start by acknowledging how difficult it is. It's a tough job, especially if you're working at the same time. So one of the things I've talked and written a lot about parenting, and one of the things I'll say first up is to try to adopt the philosophy of good enough parenting. I think a lot of us try to be perfect parents, and particularly I think working mums try to be the perfect worker, the perfect mum, the perfect wife, etc. It's virtually impossible to be perfect at all of it. It is, in fact, impossible to be perfect at all of those things. And I think a lot of us, I think particularly working mums, are very hard on themselves if they don't get everything perfect, if they don't, have the perfect lunch for their kids and all the clothes perfectly washed or whatever. And so again, the first thing I'd sort of recommend is to adopt the philosophy of good enough parenting, which is just do the best you can. Accept that it won't be perfect, but that's okay. It doesn't really matter if things aren't 100% perfect 100% of the time. And so coming back to the question then, it's the same with any of those things, whether it's getting your child ready for school or getting yourself breakfast. Just do the best you can. In an ideal world, we would all sit down and have a well-balanced, nutritious meal. We'd take our time over it. We'd enjoy it. But as you said, that's hard to do. It's often a lot more rush than that. And so, if the food's not 100% nutritious, it doesn't really matter. Just do the best you can as often as you can, get it right as often as you can. And also, I suppose, don't feel like you've got to do it all on your own. I mean, you talked about working mums, but hopefully the husbands and fathers can help as well. We'll be helping, or that other people in the workplace or friends can help as well. I think as a general rule for all of these things, I think sometimes we, too many of us just try to be too strong on our own. Now that's okay. We do want to cope, obviously, and we want to do the best we can, but we don't always have to do it on our own. So if we can reach out and ask for help, whether it's from our, husband or wife or boyfriend or girlfriend, or maybe a parent or sibling or a colleague, reaching out and asking for help is a form of strength and something that can make a lot of things a lot easier.
Right. Okay. So finally, how can our listeners reach out to you, Tim?
Well, if they want to find me, they can go to my website is drhappy.com.au. That's drhappy.com.au. They can find me on Instagram and Facebook at The Happiness Institute, or Twitter at Dr. Happy. So I'd love for people to come and say hello. And if they've got any other questions, they can feel free to ask.
Brilliant. Okay, that was a great conversation with you, Tim. Thanks a lot for joining me in the Vantage HR Influencers podcast.
Thanks again for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Vantage HR Influencers podcast. Please do subscribe to Vantage HR Influencers podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and our YouTube channel for new episodes.